If there's any deck in the format right now that's the Boogeyman, it would be Voltempest here. This is definitely the deck to beat, considered one of the best, if not the best deck in the set 1 format, and I've got my list here to show to you all. I have not played as nearly as many games with this deck as I have with my Capital deck, so this is more of a cookie cutter list for you all to get started with, and I'll point out when there are some flex slots for you to try out your own stuff to make your own and optimize this deck. With that being said, let's get right into the list. So despite the namesake of this deck being Voltempest, what this deck really is a hand control deck that just uses Voltempest as a possible win condition. And as such, I want to talk about what I think is the most powerful, or at least one of the most powerful cards in the deck, and that is Sparkkit here. This is our main hand control card of the deck, along with one other card I'll get into next. And of course, Sparkkit is just that powerful Nexus ability to look at your opponent's hand and discard a card. The reason this is so powerful is the hand information. It lets you go from having to make predictions about what your opponent can possibly do to just knowing what your opponent has in hand to be able to play around. And the fact that you get to rip a card out of the hand is such a huge swing in just value, but also it just sets the pace of the game. Where Sparkkit feels the most insane is on turn 1 if you have a way to Nexus with it, because before your opponent can even get to react, you get to rip the best card out of their hand and know exactly what they can do on their next turn minus the card that they draw into for turn. And that usually just sets the pace of the game in your favor right from the bat and can be really hard for the opponent to come back from. This card honestly feels super oppressive, especially on that turn 1 play, with its only real weakness being, well, of course, if your opponent has no cards in hand, but really if you're behind on board. If you're behind on board, this card does nothing to help you, and if anything, is just setting you further behind. So definitely don't play if your opponent has Elestrals established on board that you cannot deal with otherwise. You want to be able to deal with those first because that is what's winning you the game. But in terms of just setting the pace in your favor and establishing a presence on board, Sparkkit is phenomenal for that. So that's 3 copies, because if we can open this with any Nexus bank, you're off to the races amazingly. The second card for this hand control package here is Astrabbit. This one, instead of controlling your opponent's hand, it's instead controlling our hand with that nice ability to check top 3 to add a card from among them's hand and shuffle the rest back. So this replaces itself when it's cast, and if you can put additional spirits onto it, you get additional checks, which is just generating you advantage at that point. The top 3, of course, means that you can pick the best one from that bunch instead of just drawing, so it is just better than drawing 1 card. And on top of that, that big 5 defense is a huge body on board. So this is value on top of a big body and presence on board. 5 defense is really hard to beat over. The opponent is either going to need to have multi-card combos to hit over it with their 1 spirits, or they're going to have to expend spirits and stuff like Molestation to be able to hit over it. So this card, just a presence on board, plus to hand, and the fact that it doesn't even reveal is really strong because your opponent doesn't know what you add. And also notably, with Sparkkit being a Nexus effect, getting the Sparkkit plus Astrabbit out on board is massive, because all of a sudden you're just swinging the advantage even more on board. Sparkkit be able to neg your opponent with gain that information, Astrabbit be able to give you an additional card that your opponent does not know about. If that is not value, I don't know what it is. So if you, again, the core of these 2 is just such a strong value engine that a lot of times it is very difficult if you can get ahead and establish these 2 for your opponent to come back. Honestly, it's nearly impossible to do that. With the hand control cards out of the way, let's talk about the top end in Voltempest here. I run a 2-2 lineup of Elechik and Griffuse, and then the 1 Voltempest here. This is just to complement the hand control of Astrabbit and Sparkkit. I think that is much stronger. It's just a really powerful way if we don't see it to still have a big swing turn, but it's also a great way to just kind of close out the game after doing the hand looping shenanigans at that point. Most of the time you're winning off of this, but it just secures their win even more. So since this is just an on top of, I do cut the ratios a bit more. You can, of course, up like the ratios of Griffuse to be able to go into Voltempest more consistently by finding your Griffuse, but I don't think that's necessarily more optimal in the meta than just running this as a cherry on top per se of what we've already got going on. So the 2 Elechik to help us more consistently find our Zeus. This is also very nice because our Elestrals do not hit 5 attack except outside of Griffuse. So the 1 spirits only hit max 4 attack, and Zeus can help us hit over stuff a bit more easily on top of being our bread and butter to allow us Voltempest and Griffuse to work. 2 Griffuse, since it is the cherry on top, just to help us get into the Voltempest, and we can get away with running the 1 Voltempest because we've got Griffuse to find it. And frankly, if Griffuse is being stopped, it's usually not getting destroyed, because the 2 easy answers are Pandora's box as well as the Gorgon's gaze, and at which point we're just trying to leverage the fact the opponent's using spirits to stop this without actually having to destroy it. So we might be committing a lot to it, and we might be able to use forcing the opponent to use those spirits to just close out anyway with our 1-drops. or we're just going into the Voltempest anyway and probably winning. So I only expect to get one Voltempest down, hence only the one Voltempest in the main deck. And of course, Voltempest just very strong here with the protection if you have Zeus on board from targeting, which stops most things. The real outs are probably stuff like Alter or Tsunami and then into a Veritaqua or a way to snipe the Zeus. It's just not that easy to do. It does take a bit of work in specific deck builds, which is why this card is so powerful. It's one of the hardest out. And then, of course, one of the easiest answers is Shield of Achilles. But with Voltempest's ability just to disenchant to burn 3 each turn, you can just not attack until like you attack. Either they don't have the spirits to use shield or it uses all their spirits. So this card, it just perfectly plays around most of the answers, or it's just too hard to out, meaning it is the perfect kind of top end to this deck. Now, so far, I've only showed off 8 1-drops, meaning more than that in this deck for it to be able to find them and run fine. So I run 2 Jolten here to help search out the stadium. This is just a great way to deck thin. That's something else I forgot to mention off the the Elechik, is that it's also a deck thin, meaning it can help us find different pieces that we can't necessarily search out. And Jolten's the same way. The stadium's also really nice in this deck since our Elestrals only hit 4 attack to either stop my opponent's stadium. That way they're not getting much higher attack, like the 5-drops hitting 6, and it then allows our own 4-drops to hit 5 attack to more easily hit over stuff, or even higher if we can get multiple spirits on it. So Jolten's just great for that, and it's a 4-attacker in itself. It just fits right in with this kind of hand control idea of the deck, just being able to search out a card, loop it to hand, and give us some more advantage with our Elestrals. Really helps with the overall consistency. And then rounding out the 1 spirits, we got 2 Toxion here. This is the biggest flex spot of the deck. You could always run maybe some Boombats. You could always consider running Quackle for some regen, but I think Toxion fits right in with this. Be able to expend 1 for the opponent to kind of force lethal a bit sooner. And the other reason I really like Toxion, well, in addition to its 4 attack, so there's 2 reasons. The 4 attack just fits in so nicely with this deck, since it caps out at 4 attack, just some more good attackers that pair well with Zeus and the Stadium. But also, it's another card that can receive spirits off of the Sparkkit here and gain some advantage. So now we're hand looping the opponent, gain some information, and burning the opponent. The Astrabbit combo is a bit better, but is a great backup, so we kind of have double benefit, just great synergies with these cards. And we got another Nexus card as well that also works really well with this Toxion here. So it's just a great way to kind of push some extra damage. And as Baron perfectly showed off in the Lost ECL finals match, this card is actually great for finishing the game as well. So this one just made a lot of sense, and compared to the other 1-drops that could be run in this deck, I do think this one is my personal favorite. But again, it's a flex slot, test out different stuff, find what works best for your playstyle. Moving over to the runes, specifically the Thunder runes, 3 Zeus. Even though we do have the Elechik to search them out, this card is just super great for this deck for multiple reasons. Nexus Bank for Sparkkit, so really want to max it out to hopefully find Zeus plus a Sparkkit is most optimal. Then of course we got the nice ability to just kind of lower attack stats, make our stuff easier to hit over, and also the bonus with Voltempest. So in terms of like priority, I say Nexus Bank is number 1 with specifically Sparkkit and one of our other cards, and then 2 is probably, I would say, the Voltempest protection. We definitely want to see that for that. And then 3rd is then its effect. But it also gives us more liberty to maybe not throw as many spirits onto the Zeus if we find multiple, and still have a Zeus to play down when we want to go for that Voltempest for a turn or Nexus off of runes. So just maxing out gives us some extra flexibility even with that search that I think is totally worth it. So 3 copies made a lot of sense for this deck. Then of course we got to run the 2 Mount Olympus to search off the Jolten. No reason to run any other stadiums in this deck, just based on we've got all Thunder Elestrals, so that makes sense. So the 2 Mount Olympus, only need 2 because it's not a super crucial card, and we can find it off the Elechik. I think the Zeus is way more crucial, and I like the rune slots for other stuff. Don't really want multiple stadiums because don't necessarily want to be nexusing off of them either. Most of the time we just want to keep it established, so 2 feels fine. Moving on to some out of element runes, run the 3 Earthquake just because it's the best removal card, especially in a deck that likes to start off with either like Sparkkit, or not Sparkkit, like start off with either Sparkkit, no actually yeah, Sparkkit and Astrabbit here. Sometimes it's a bit hard to hit over the opponent's Elestrals, so Earthquake is just a great way to clean that up and to kind of keep some pressure off of those Elestrals and not let my opponent be able to ascend or get too far ahead. It's just great generic removal that probably either should cost 1 additional spirit or have a stipulation to it, but thus we got Earthquake as is, and it's a strong removal card, so we really want to max it out. And then the last out of element rune is a counter rune here, 3 Tsunami, just because it's a great way to kind of keep the pressure off our Elestrals since they all kind of cap out at 4 attack. Sometimes my opponent might try attacking with a 5 attack, and just switching him to defense is very nice. 1, to protect them, but also 2, a lot of times those 5 attack Elestrals have lower defense, which is great for our 4 attacks to attack over. So this card makes a lot of sense for just slowing down and making this deck as annoying as possible to kind of deal with these Elestrals. It's really going to take their counter runes, their earthquakes, their destruction effects in general to really get them off board, and the harder we can make it for the opponent to do that or to use resources to actually get it, the happier we are. So Tsunami, cheap, easy way to protect them from one of the freest ways to remove Elestrals, seems good to me. Probably the biggest counter in this deck is the Altar of Stars. This card is super flexible, and I can't begin to explain all the situations that this card is amazing in. The Nexus helps trigger Astrabbit and Toxion defensively or offensively. You can even use it offensively to gain additional value, burn opponent for more spirits. It can keep attacks off our Elestrals, kind of like Tsunami does, even though it only affects one Elestral. Of note, this card does not target, just like Tsunami, so they do get around Voltempest and other protection style effects, which can be super useful. But it can also create really fun plays. Like one of the reasons I run Toxion, what I alluded to in the ECL final, was being able to use Altar to get a spirit onto Toxion and actually Nexus another spirit onto Toxion to just pump out even more damage. There's just so many applications. It can help save spirits from an Elestral. Like say you've got a Sparkkit on board with 2 spirits, you can use one to cast Altar, another one to Nexus the spirit off to conserve spirits. There's so many applications. The sky's the limit with this card. You really have to mess around with it to see its full potential and really think of the different ways you can do it. And with the ability to use Jolten and Sparkkit to search out cards that give us a Nexus bank to use this off of, this card is super useful because that's usually the biggest limitation with this card. If you don't have a way to Nexus with it, this card is a dead card. But in this deck, that is seldomly the case, and it is really, really strong. So 3 copies of this card for sure. Continuing the counter rune trend, 3 Gorgon's Gaze, just because this is a great way to stop any effects, just ascensions, any shenanigans. Gorgon's Gaze is a great way to stop it. Can stop Griffuses from being able to ascend, and a ton of other stuff. Like this got great applications for shutting down effects primarily, as well as some attacks, which can then of course protect our Sparkkits, our Astrabbits, whatever, to kind of keep board presence. This deck, I mean, counter runes, let's be real, counter runes are the meta right now. If this is a meta deck, you want to max out on the counter runes, and that's what this deck tries to do, and Gorgon's Gaze plays its role perfectly. 3 PTA, of course, again, just a great way to kind of keep tempo on board by removing the opponent's Celestial. Sometimes the 2 attack can matter, especially against our 4 attack Elestrals or 5 defense Astrabbit. And again, it's just mostly here to remove the Elestral from board to keep up, to make sure that my opponent isn't getting too far ahead. Again, counter rune meta makes sense to play the good counter runes. And that's the exact same reason for running 3 Shield of Achilles, just a great way for non-targeted attack protection, bouncing Elestral back to hand. The more I play with this card, the more I actually think that this is probably one of the weaker counter runes, funny enough, because it can help loop good effects back to your opponent's hand for them to reuse, which isn't great, isn't always relevant depending on the matchup, so this is still a great card to run, and it's better to have it than not. But funny enough, as strong as this sounded initially, I do think this is one of the weaker ones, but not weak enough not to run. Like, don't get me wrong, I say it's weaker, it's still like really good. It's still like A tier amongst all these other counters. It's just like, if I were to rank them all, it would be at the bottom of A tier instead of some of the other ones that are towards the top. But it just makes sense, a ton of battle tricks to protect our Elestrals, and it also makes it more likely that we can ascend into our Griffuse, keep Sparkkits, Astrabbits around for Nexus shenanigans, and the like. Finally, I can stop talking about counter runes because I felt like a broken record during that section. 2 Ambrosia, just to give some extra recovery. It also means that we can run lower spirit counts in our spirit deck and be able to loop specific spirits back for stuff like our Tsunamis, for our Earthquakes to be able to use. It's just a great utility card, and I also like it because it does, for this one card, you go -1 in hand, but in theory, you can play 2 additional cards if they're like 1 spirit cards. That's on average what they cost. So this is just great for some extensions, especially since this deck is not running the Crackle, and because it's on a rune, we still get our normal cast, which is super important. So 2 Ambrosia to round off the deck just made a lot of sense to me. And one final thing about Ambrosia, I usually like to hold these cards for its utility to loop back specific spirits. It gives me more freedom on what spirits I can use for my spirit deck and not worry about running into a scenario where I don't have the exact spirits I need. The only times I would say just fire this off is if 1, you need just spirits and spirit deck to actually survive, or 2, there's risk of this being popped if you set it or discard from hand, or both. But most of the time, I don't see many decks that are popping it on board but also trying to loop it from hand. So a lot of times it's either safe in hand, or if you're against like another Sparkkit, you can just set it anyway to do that. For the spirit deck, I run 13 Zaptor. This deck is primary Thunder, so I want to make sure I have enough spirits to use all those cards. But of course, I do run some out of element cards such as the Earthquake, so I run 4 Teratlas, For those, the theory is that on average, I'm going to see 1 to 2 per game, seldomly 3, so I want enough to be able to play those 2 when they pop up, but I also don't want to cut away from more Zaptor and then have trouble seeing Thunder Spears to play my Thunder cards. Same reason why I run the 2 Leviaphin for the 3 Tsunami. They only cost 1, so I just want enough to play 2. And of course, I've got Ambrosia as a backup if need be, if I need to loop back Teratlas or Leviaphin from the Underworld to be able to play a 3rd copy. Or maybe I decide, based on the pace of the game, how it's going, that I can use Teratlas and Leviaphin because I do have an Ambrosia in hand for the generic runes, spend for damage, and I can just loop them back when I do find that 2nd Tsunami or Earthquake. And finally, 1 Lycarus because I only expect to really go into that Griffuse once and attempt to go to Voltempest. Once this Griffuse gets removed, I think that's usually it. The game's either winning because my opponent used too many spirits and I can win off on my 1-drops, or my opponent is just winning outright. So I thought the 1 Lycarus was fine, and I can just keep re-enchanting my Zaptors for Voltempest burn effect. So while there is theoretically some wiggle room here, like you could really run the 2nd Lycarus if you wanted to. You can maybe cut down 1 Leviaphin for just the 1 Tsunami. But honestly, I feel like this spirit deck here is the most balanced between having the spirits to play your out of element cards as needed, but not have too many of them where you're just wishing you had more Zaptor. I really do think this is the proper ratio for it. And if you're struggling with it, I'd encourage maybe just reevaluating how you're using your spirits. And what are you expending? What are you using to cast your generic runes? When are you doing it? To just reevaluate your spirit efficiency usage. That is definitely the biggest skill in Elestrals. So if you're struggling with that, hey, I don't blame you. It's definitely a tough skill, but I would suggest looking at that before trying to change this. Moving over to the side deck, this is definitely the most debatable of the bunch because I have not played as many games with it. I just threw something together to give you a template. I run the 1 extra Voltempest in case you're going up against Pandora's box and you're worried about it getting milled. You can slot in a 2nd one. Though honestly, if Pandora's box hits the 1 of Voltempest in your deck, that just stinks. But I can definitely see an argument for wanting to run the 2nd. Then I run 2 Boombatt just for some removal, just great Elestral removal on a body. It is a 1-for-1 giving up your normal enchant, which isn't the best, but of course, theoretically, if you have like Sparkkit or Alter, you could always throw an extra spirit on it, so it doesn't technically leave the board. This is just if there's, for some reason, something that this deck can't really handle. I can't really think of anything that this deck really can't handle. They just need a Boombatt to pop. It's theoretically there. The one I really like, though, is the 3 Raiceros here, because in a proper match here where you are using your side deck, if you know that you are going first, I think it'd be cool to slot in Raiceros as just an extra really good card to throw down on turn 1, because if you can throw this down on turn 1 and you know you're not up against a Thunder deck, then your opponent will have trouble actually answering it, and it sets the tempo in your favor. It's just, again, an extra really good card to play on turn 1 if needed. Maybe like cut out the Toxion, because those aren't the best on turn 1. And it sets up easy Ascension into Griffuse if you need to, though that early in the game might be a bit preemptive and you might just be better off using this as a really strong tempo swing just to stop your opponent from attacking. Then I choose to run 3 Thunderstorm if you need some rune removal, because this deck does not have any. I still think it's more optimal just to try to bait your opponent to actually use their runes, especially their counter runes. But if you're in a matchup where you know you really need to pop some runes, maybe you're up against another Voltempest as well, and you just want a way to pop their Zeus to kind of keep them off Voltempest or get rid of the protection effect to Earthquake, that is an option here. And then wrapping it up, I do run the 3 Pandora's box as another answer to Voltempest and other like Aeolis or like Hydrate Twindra. This card is great for those matchups as well. It's just a phenomenal side deck card to shut down some of those decks that can do some crazy swings if you don't have the proper answers to it, and this just gives you some more answers to it. And as I did my Capital deck profile, I like to do just a test hand here to show the mulligan. Of course, best case scenario would be Sparkkit plus any Nexus Bank to get the game started going first. Going second, Astrabbit might be a bit better just because your opponent has an Elestral on board they have to deal with, but you might have Earthquake to be able to answer it. Let's generally look. Let's just say we're going first. So we'll do 1 for going first and 1 for going second. So for going first, got some counter runes. Those are always great to see. Alter, Astrabbit, and Elechik. So here, this is really nice. Astrabbit is a really good card to start with, but here, as you can see, we got the Alter, so it might be better to do Elechik, find Zeus. That way we can set up Alter plus Astrabbit. The next turn, we got plenty of counter runes to stave off the opponent's Elestrals from Elechik. And like, this is an A-okay hand. Even though you don't have Zeus, you still have just value in hand. You've got counter runes. The counter runes are super important to be able to keep off the opponent. So like the hands that you might want to mulligan back is if you don't have any counter runes, especially if you don't have like any, maybe if you have like a Toxion and like Voltempest, like really you just want a good normal cast, which is usually your Astrabbits, your Sparkkits if you have a Zeus, your Elechiks, your Joltens. Those are kind of what you're looking for, and then of course some counter runes. If you don't see any counter runes and probably not an Astrabbit in hand, just mulligan it back. but like you can see here, we just go Elechik, search it out. We can set these, and then next turn when we draw, of course, like we'll search it out. So that might not be the Toxion here, but we can just, for sake of demonstration, go Astrabbit, check top 3, and we can find some good stuff. Like, well, there's the Zeus we would have added, but we can find like more counter runes. We can find an Earthquake for removal. So obviously not the best example, so I didn't search out the Zeus and shuffle it up, but you get the general idea of what this deck can get started going on turn 1. So if we're going second, of course, you want to find more counter runes, but usually you want to find some more proactive Elestrals and cards to try to answer the board. So let's see what we got here. Double Jolten, Elechik, Astrabbit, and Poison Tipped Arrow. This admittedly is not the best hand, so I think it is debatable whether or not you mulligan back, but you also have plenty of things you can do. You've got Elechik to search out Zeus to start contesting the board, Jolten for the stay and start contesting the board, or if you want to play it a bit slowly, you can always go Astrabbit and then set Poison Tipped Arrow and see what you can find off the Astrabbit. Oh, and going second, of course, we do get the draw. So this hand isn't unplayable, so I think here would just take some testing to see into what different matchups that maybe you would want to try to mulligan this to find some more cards versus just one. This is doable. I think this is very doable. So like the draw per turn would be Zeus. So yeah, we got plenty of stuff here. We can just go Astrabbit to try to check top 3 to search out. We find Sparkkit's not bad with the Zeus, but of course we need to catch the board first. We don't have any Earthquakes, so maybe just take the Tsunami for some extra control. And then of course here we got Tsunami, we got Poison Tipped Arrow, we got a big body on board, and we can start searching out like Stadium, start searching out Divine Runes, just to kind of keep the pressure on, and we've got Zeus to help out with that. So not a great hand, but not a bad hand either. And of course, just to want to reiterate, going first, the most insane hand is if you see Sparkkit and Zeus, but it's like you should keep that. Ideally, you also want some counter runes with it, so there's a chance that if you don't find any counter runes, it might not be the best hand to keep, but just being able to go Sparkkit, Zeus, and just get that hand information, rip out your opponent's best card is still really, very strong. And 15 counter runes, it's actually pretty likely that you'll find a counter rune along with it. The reality is that even though you're ripping the best card of your opponent's hand, they might still have a way to hit over Sparkkit, especially if it's a more aggressive deck that might need it. But hey, that is up for more testing as well. And again, most of the time you should be able to find that. But that is my Voltempest deck list. And I know the comments are probably going to crucify me for running the promo Voltempest in the side deck instead of the main deck. Phoebe did an amazing job with this, just personal preference. I like the original one, so that is the one I chose to run in my main deck. But also a reminder that this is a cookie cutter list. I try to point out some of the flex slots for this deck for you to test different things to find to your liking. But overall, I think this is a fantastic starting point for anyone aspiring to play Voltempest or learn the deck for tournaments or really any purpose. Let me know down below in the comments if you'd like to see some gameplay of this deck to get a better idea of how this deck pilots. I can definitely deliver on that. And while you're at it, please consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell so you're notified when I do upload more Elestrals content, because there's definitely plenty more coming out. But with that being said, though, look forward to more content coming out real soon.